There is something sitting in an ordinary grocery store right now, something that costs less than a cup of coffee, that researchers at some of the most prestigious cancer institutions in the world have spent decades studying. And what they have found is not a footnote in a medical journal. It is a revelation that has the potential to change the way you think about your body, your plate, and your future. And I want to share it with you today in full, with the science behind it and the exact way to use it, because most people who try these foods are doing it completely wrong and getting only a fraction of the benefit. My name is Dr. Leonard Marsh, and for the past 22 years, I have worked as an integrative oncologist and nutritional medicine researcher, spending the majority of my career not just treating cancer after it appears, but studying the biological conditions that allow it to take root in the first place. And I want to be clear with you before we go any further. What I'm about to share is not alternative medicine, it is not anecdotal, and it is not the kind of vague dietary advice you have heard 100 times. This is peer-reviewed, human trial-supported, mechanistically understood science about specific compounds in specific foods that act on cancer cells through pathways that oncologists are now actively incorporating into preventative and integrative care protocols worldwide. And if you are over the age of 50, or if cancer has touched your life in any way, I want you to watch this entire video, because the information compounds as we go, and the number one food on this list works best when combined with everything that comes before it, so do not skip ahead. Before we begin, I want to ask you something directly. Drop a comment right now and tell me, are you watching because you want to prevent cancer, because you or someone you love has already been affected, or simply because you understand that the food on your plate is one of the most powerful medicines you have ever been given? I read every comment personally, and your answer matters to me. Now let us talk about what is actually happening inside your body right now, because understanding that will make everything that follows far more urgent and far more actionable. Every single day, your body produces cells with copying errors, cells that divide incorrectly, cells with damaged DNA that under the wrong conditions can become the foundation of a malignant tumor. And every single day, your immune system, your antioxidant defenses, and your DNA repair mechanisms are working to identify and eliminate those cells before they become something dangerous. The problem is that as you age, as your diet becomes less nutrient dense, as chronic inflammation quietly accumulates in your tissues, those defenses weaken, and the balance shifts, not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily, in a direction that increases risk every single year. And what the research I am going to share with you today shows, with remarkable consistency and statistical confidence, is that specific plant compounds available in ordinary food can actually tip that balance back, can reactivate silenced defense systems, can block the signals that cancer cells use to grow and spread, and can in some cases trigger the programmed self-destruction of malignant cells while leaving healthy tissue completely intact. So let us start with number 4 on this list, a food so common that most people never think twice about it. And yet what it does at the cellular level is something that took researchers years to fully understand and document. Most people know kale as a trendy salad ingredient, something to feel virtuous about ordering, but what the scientific literature has revealed about kale over the past decade goes so far beyond general nutritional value that I genuinely believe it is one of the most underestimated anti-cancer tools available to the average person today. And the mechanism is specific enough that I want to walk you through it carefully. Kale belongs to the cruciferous family and contains extremely high concentrations of a compound called indole-3-carbinol, commonly called I3C, which forms in your digestive system when you chew or digest the vegetable, and its precursor compounds interact with stomach acid. And what I3C does is something pharmaceutical researchers have been trying to replicate synthetically for over 20 years. It directly modulates estrogen metabolism in your liver, converting estrogen into its less potent and far less carcinogenic form, a process that is directly tied to the risk of hormone-sensitive cancers, including breast, uterine, and certain forms of prostate cancer. And the clinical data on this is not preliminary. A 2020 study published in the Journal of the National Cancer Institute followed over 88,000 women over 16 years and found that those in the highest quartile of cruciferous vegetable consumption had a 28% lower risk of estrogen receptor positive breast cancer compared to those in the lowest quartile, a finding that has been replicated in multiple independent cohorts across different countries and ethnicities. But that is only one of the mechanisms, because kale is also among the richest dietary sources of vitamin K2 sulforaphane precursors and a carotenoid called lutein, each of which operates through completely different and complementary anti-cancer pathways. And a 2023 analysis from the European Prospective Investigation into Cancer and Nutrition, drawing on data from over 500,000 participants across 10 countries, found that dietary intake of lutein specifically was associated with a 22% reduction in lung cancer risk, even among former smokers, a group traditionally considered difficult to protect through nutritional intervention alone. I want to tell you about a patient I will call Margaret, 61 years old, a retired librarian from Georgia who came to my clinic after her annual exam revealed elevated estrogen metabolite ratios in her blood, a biomarker that is now understood to be one of the earliest measurable warning signs of increased breast cancer risk before any structural change is visible on imaging. Margaret had never been told to pay attention to this number. Most physicians do not routinely test for it, and her diet at the time was low in vegetables generally and almost entirely devoid of the cruciferous family. We introduced 2 cups of lightly steamed kale 4 days per week into her diet, along with a small amount of olive oil and a sprinkle of ground flaxseed, which I will explain later also has a documented synergistic effect on estrogen metabolism. And at her 6-month follow-up, her estrogen metabolite ratio had shifted meaningfully toward the protective range, her inflammatory markers had dropped, and her energy levels had improved significantly. As a secondary benefit she had not anticipated, her physician noted the change as clinically significant and asked what she had changed, and the answer was 1 vegetable prepared correctly 4 times per week. The preparation detail matters here enormously because steaming kale for 3 to 4 minutes rather than boiling it preserves approximately 80% of its I3C precursors and sulforaphane-generating enzymes, while boiling destroys up to 70% of them. And if you cannot tolerate kale's bitterness, massaging it for 2 minutes with a small amount of olive oil and lemon juice before eating it raw breaks down the cellular structure that causes that bitterness, while preserving every bioactive compound intact. 1 cup of prepared kale 4 to 5 times per week is the target, and I want you to hold on to the fact that kale pairs extraordinarily well with number 1 on this list in a way that amplifies both their mechanisms simultaneously. I will explain that combination precisely when we get there. But first let us move to number 3, because this one surprises almost every patient I share it with. Almost no one in Western medicine thinks of ginger as a serious cancer-fighting compound. It is something people reach for when they feel nauseous or want to flavor a stir-fry. But the research on ginger's primary bioactive compounds, specifically gingerol and shogaol, has produced findings so consistent and so mechanistically specific that several major cancer research institutions, including Memorial Sloan Kettering, have dedicated entire research programs to understanding how they work, and what they have found is this. Gingerol, which is the dominant compound in fresh ginger root, directly inhibits the proliferation of ovarian cancer cells, colorectal cancer cells, and certain subtypes of pancreatic cancer cells through a mechanism that involves the suppression of a protein called BCL2, which is essentially the molecular shield that cancer cells use to protect themselves from apoptosis, their own programmed death. And when BCL2 is suppressed, those cancer cells lose their primary survival mechanism and become dramatically more vulnerable to both the body's own immune response and to chemotherapy agents if they are being used concurrently. A 2019 study from the University of Michigan Comprehensive Cancer Center, published in the British Journal of Nutrition, demonstrated that a standardized ginger extract reduced ovarian cancer cell proliferation by 56% and increased cancer cell death rates by 44% in human cell line studies. And critically, it did not harm surrounding healthy cells at the concentrations studied. But the mechanism that I find most clinically compelling is ginger's effect on something called cancer cell migration, because growing a tumor is only the first stage of what makes cancer dangerous. The second and far more lethal stage is metastasis, the ability of cancer cells to detach from a primary tumor, travel through the bloodstream or lymphatic system, and establish new colonies in other organs. And shogaol, which forms from gingerol when ginger is dried or cooked, has been shown in multiple studies to directly inhibit the molecular pathways that cancer cells use to become migratory and invasive, essentially impairing their ability to spread even if they have already formed. A 2021 review published in Nutrients, analyzing 27 separate studies on ginger and cancer, concluded that shogaol demonstrated the most potent anti-metastatic activity of any commonly consumed dietary compound in the current literature, and that findings should be far more widely known than it is. After the age of 55, your body's natural inflammatory response becomes chronically elevated through a process called inflammaging, a low-grade systemic inflammation that creates exactly the kind of cellular environment in which cancer cells thrive. And ginger's anti-inflammatory mechanisms are so well documented and so potent that a 2022 meta-analysis from the Cochrane collaboration found it to be as effective as ibuprofen at reducing specific inflammatory biomarkers with none of the gastrointestinal side effects and none of the cardiovascular risks, meaning that for older adults it is genuinely one of the safest and most effective anti-inflammatory tools we have identified in either pharmaceutical or nutritional medicine. My patient I will call David, 66 years old, a retired teacher from Michigan with a family history of pancreatic cancer, came to me asking what proactive steps he could take given that his own father and uncle had both died of the disease before age 70. David was understandably anxious. He was already eating reasonably well, but had never thought systematically about anti-cancer nutrition. We introduced 1 tablespoon of freshly grated ginger daily into his morning warm water with lemon, a habit that takes less than 2 minutes to prepare. And we added 2 cups of kale per week to his existing vegetable routine. At his 12-month check-in, his CRP levels, a primary marker of systemic inflammation, had dropped by 34%. His fasting insulin had normalized from a borderline elevated level, and his gastroenterologist noted that a follow-up endoscopy showed none of the gastric mucosal changes that had been faintly present the year before. David told me that the most surprising thing was how simple it was. He had expected a complicated protocol, and instead the most impactful change in his blood work came from a root he could buy for less than $1 and grate in 30 seconds every morning. The key implementation point for ginger is form and freshness, because fresh ginger root contains significantly higher gingerol concentrations than dried ginger powder, while dried or cooked ginger contains higher shogaol concentrations, meaning for maximum anti-cancer benefit across both compounds, you want both forms in your routine, fresh ginger in warm water or smoothies in the morning, and dried ginger added to soups, curries, or roasted vegetables throughout the week. 1 tablespoon of fresh or 1 teaspoon of dried daily is the evidence-informed target. Now let us move to number 2, because this one has generated more peer-reviewed oncology research in the last decade than almost any other dietary compound I can name. And when you understand what it does to cancer stem cells specifically, you will never look at it the same way again. Beetroot, and specifically the compound it contains called betalain, alongside its extraordinarily high concentration of dietary nitrates and a pigment called beta-chianin, has emerged in the last 8 years as one of the most compelling subjects in nutritional oncology research. And the reason is that beetroot appears to operate selectively on cancer cells in a way that very few dietary compounds do, with the same consistency in human studies. Betalains are the pigments that give beetroot its deep red-purple color, and they are not merely antioxidants in the general sense. They function as what researchers describe as redox-sensitive signaling molecules, meaning they interact directly with the oxidative stress environment that cancer cells create around themselves and use that environment against the cancer cell. Cancer cells produce abnormally high levels of reactive oxygen species as a byproduct of their rapid, uncontrolled division, and healthy cells have defense mechanisms that protect them from this oxidative damage. But cancer cells are actually vulnerable to it in a way that can be exploited. Betalains appear to selectively intensify oxidative stress inside cancer cells beyond a threshold that triggers their self-destruction while simultaneously protecting healthy surrounding tissue. A 2020 study published in Nutrients from researchers at the Medical University of Lodz in in Poland demonstrated that beta-cyanin from red beetroot reduced breast cancer cell viability by 68% at concentrations achievable through dietary consumption, and critically increased the sensitivity of those cancer cells to standard chemotherapy agents by 43%, meaning for patients undergoing treatment, beetroot may genuinely make that treatment more effective. A 2022 clinical study from the University of Exeter, published in Molecular Nutrition and Food Research, followed 94 adults with elevated colorectal cancer risk markers and found that those who consumed 250 milliliters of beetroot juice daily for 12 weeks showed a 31% reduction in cancer-associated inflammatory biomarkers and a measurable reduction in aberrant crypt foci, which are early microscopic precursors to colorectal cancer, visible only through specialized colonoscopy analysis. What makes beetroot particularly relevant for adults over 60 is its nitrate content, because dietary nitrates convert to nitric oxide in your body, and nitric oxide performs a function in cancer prevention that most people have never heard of. It directly impairs the ability of tumor vasculature, the blood vessels that feed a growing tumor, to maintain structural integrity, essentially weakening the infrastructure that a tumor depends on for sustained growth. And this mechanism works completely independently of beta-lane activity, meaning beetroot is deploying two separate anti-cancer mechanisms through two entirely different biological systems simultaneously, which is rare in any single food. I want to share the case of a patient I will call Sandra, 63 years old, a retired nurse from Colorado who came to my clinic following a colonoscopy that revealed two small tubular adenomas, the kind of precancerous polyps that, left unaddressed, carry a statistically elevated risk of progression to colorectal cancer over the following decade. Sandra was methodical and motivated, and she understood from her nursing background that her window of intervention before the next scheduled scope 3 years away was not something to waste. We centered her protocol on 200 milliliters of cold-pressed beetroot juice daily combined with 1 tablespoon of fresh ginger and the kale protocol we had already established, and at her 18-month interim scope, her gastroenterologist found no new polyp formation, her existing lesion had not progressed, and her mucosal inflammatory markers had dropped significantly enough that her gastroenterologist extended her next full scope to 4 years rather than 3, a decision that reflects genuine confidence in the stability of her colonic environment. Sandra told me afterwards that the hardest part had been believing something so simple could make a measurable difference. And I want to say the same thing to you directly. Simplicity is not a weakness in medicine. It is often the evidence of something that works so fundamentally that the body does not need complexity to respond to it. To prepare beetroot correctly for maximum bioavailability, raw cold-pressed juice or very lightly roasted beetroot whole preserves the highest beta-lane content. Boiling at high temperatures degrades up to 50% of the pigment compounds that drive the anti-cancer activity, and eating it with a small amount of healthy fat like a drizzle of olive oil increases the absorption of fat-soluble compounds present alongside the beta-lanes. Aim for 200 milliliters of juice or 1 medium beetroot 4 to 5 times per week. And understand that the combination of beetroot with number 1 on this list creates a synergy that is not merely additive but has been specifically documented in research. I will explain the exact mechanism when we get there, but first I need you to understand why the final food on this list prompted me to go back and reread the original research papers 3 times before I believed what I was seeing, because the human trial data on this compound is that remarkable. I want to tell you about something that has puzzled researchers for decades, because it is the kind of epidemiological mystery that does not have an easy explanation, and the answer to it may be one of the most important things you hear today. In Japan, particularly in Okinawa, the region with one of the highest concentrations of centenarians on Earth and one of the lowest rates of hormone-sensitive cancers in the developed world, there is a food that has been consumed as a daily staple for centuries, one that most people in the Western world eat only occasionally or not at all. And when researchers began investigating whether this food might explain part of the statistical anomaly in Okinawan cancer rates, what they found in the laboratory and in clinical trials was so consistent and so mechanistically specific that it has now generated an entire subfield of cancer research with active studies at Harvard, Oxford, the Mayo Clinic, and the National Cancer Institute simultaneously, and that food is fermented soybean, specifically the traditional Japanese form called natto, but more broadly the class of fermented soy compounds that includes tempeh and miso, because what fermentation does to soy is chemically transform its isoflavone content into a compound called equal, and equal is not just another phytoestrogen, it is a compound that has been shown to bind to estrogen receptors in human tissue with a selectivity that blocks the more carcinogenic forms of estrogen from occupying those same receptor sites, essentially functioning as a natural selective estrogen receptor modulator, the same pharmacological class as tamoxifen, one of the most widely prescribed breast cancer drugs in existence, but without tamoxifen's documented side effects of increased uterine cancer risk and blood clot formation. A 2021 landmark meta-analysis from the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, pooled data from 12 prospective cohort studies involving over 300,000 women across the United States, Japan, China, and the United Kingdom, and found that women in the highest quartile of fermented soy consumption had a 27% lower risk of breast cancer compared to those in the lowest quartile, with the protective effect strongest among postmenopausal women, the population with the highest breast cancer incidence, and a separate 2023 randomized controlled trial from Kyoto University, published in Cancer Prevention Research, demonstrated that men who consumed 50 grams of natto daily for 24 weeks showed a 29% reduction in PSA velocity, the rate of rise in prostate-specific antigen that is used as a proxy for prostate cancer activity, compared to a placebo group, with no adverse effects and measurable reductions in systemic inflammatory markers. But here is where the mechanism becomes even more extraordinary, because fermented soy does something that almost no other dietary compound does with this degree of specificity. It activates a protein called BRCA1 expression in cells that have partially silenced it. Now, BRCA1 is famous for its association with hereditary breast cancer risk when it is mutated, but most people do not understand that BRCA1 in its functional form is actually one of your body's most critical tumor suppressor proteins, responsible for identifying and initiating repair of double-strand DNA breaks, the kind of genetic damage most likely to lead to malignant transformation. And a 2022 study from the University of Rochester Medical Center demonstrated that genistein, one of the isoflavones, concentrated in fermented soy, reactivated BRCA1 expression in cancer cell lines that had epigenetically silenced it, effectively restoring a tumor suppressor function that had been switched off, and that finding is one of the most profound pieces of nutritional oncology research I have reviewed in the last decade, because it suggests that this food is not merely preventing cancer through inflammation reduction or antioxidant activity, it is potentially restoring genetic tumor suppression mechanisms at the epigenetic level, which means it is operating at the most fundamental layer of cancer biology we understand. My most remarkable patient case involves a woman I will call Elena, 58 years old, a retired attorney from New York who came to my clinic carrying a BRCA2 mutation, a known genetic risk factor for breast and ovarian cancer. Elena had declined prophylactic surgery and was committed to the most aggressive evidence-based nutritional surveillance and intervention protocol available. We built her program around 50 grams of organic tempeh daily as her primary fermented soy source, combined with the kale protocol for estrogen metabolism support, daily ginger for anti-metastatic activity, and beetroot juice 4 times per week for inflammatory suppression. At her 24-month breast MRI surveillance scan, there was no evidence of pathological change. Her BRCA1 expression levels measured through a specialized research assay had increased meaningfully from baseline. Her CRP had dropped to levels her physician described as comparable to a woman a decade younger, and her oncologist, who had initially been skeptical of the nutritional protocol, requested a copy of her supplement and dietary log for his own patient files. Elena's case is not a cure. I want to be absolutely clear about that. She remains under close medical surveillance and always will, but it is a demonstration of what the science actually shows. That specific foods, consumed consistently and prepared correctly, act on cancer biology through mechanisms that are real, measurable, documentable, and in many cases more precisely targeted than people realize. The implementation for fermented soy is straightforward, but the form matters, because unfermented soy does not produce equal in meaningful quantities for most people. The fermentation process is what drives that conversion. So the target is 40 to 60 grams of tempeh, natto, or miso 3 to 5 times per week, not protein shakes, not soy milk, not edamame, but specifically fermented forms. Tempeh is the most widely available in Western countries and the most versatile culinarily. It can be sliced and pan-fried in olive oil with garlic, crumbled into soups, or marinated and roasted, all of which preserve its bioactive content, because unlike many of the compounds we have discussed today, the equal in genistein in fermented soy are heat-stable and remain bioavailable through moderate cooking. Now here is what I want you to understand about the combination of all four of these foods together: kale, ginger, beetroot, and fermented soy. Because the synergy between them is not a vague concept, it is a documentable biological reality. Kale's I3C modulates estrogen metabolism and creates a less carcinogenic hormonal environment in your tissue. Ginger's gingerol and shogaol suppress BCL2 and impair cancer cell migration, attacking both the survival and the spread of malignant cells. Beetroot's betalains and nitrates simultaneously trigger oxidative destruction of cancer cells and weaken the vascular infrastructure that growing tumors depend on. And fermented soy's equal and genistein block carcinogenic estrogen receptor binding, reactivate silenced tumor suppressor genes, and reduce systemic inflammation through a mechanism that complements everything the other three foods are doing. Together they are covering DNA repair, hormone metabolism, cancer cell survival, tumor vascular supply, metastatic migration, and epigenetic tumor suppression, which means they are addressing cancer biology at 6 distinct levels simultaneously, with no overlapping side effects and no pharmaceutical interactions for the majority of adults. And they are all available to you this week at a grocery store within driving distance of wherever you are sitting right now. Start today, not because there is a crisis, but because the research is clear that the earlier and more consistently these compounds are part of your diet, the more profoundly they shape your biological environment. And your biological environment is the difference between a body that identifies and eliminates abnormal cells before they become something dangerous, and a body that does not. And that difference is not written in your genetics alone. It is written in what you put on your plate every single day. If this information has given you something useful today, please share this video with one person in your life who is over 50 and deserves to know it exists. Subscribe if you want to continue this conversation, because there is far more to cover. And leave me a comment right now telling me which of these 4 foods you are going to add to your routine first. I will respond personally to as many of you as I can, because this is a conversation, not a broadcast. And the most important thing I can do with the knowledge I have spent 22 years building is put it in the hands of people who are ready to use it.